So, thank you.
Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Yeah. Have you all got very good eyesight? No. There's a little bit missing as well. Anyway, as you probably can't, some of you want me to see it at all, I don't think, but you can't see the slides maybe. If any of it's not clear, please just call out. Or if I'm starting to talk too fast, which I have a very bad habit of doing, and it will all be in English, I'm sorry to say, because I haven't mastered your complicated language. I've called the talk here Laggards or leaders, and you can see, hopefully you can see this Swedish there, which I don't think I want to try and pronounce, but I've been told that's the right translation. And it's based on some work by my colleague Isak Stoddard and myself. Unfortunately, it's just missing off the end of the slide there. That may be a problem with some of the slides. But I can point you towards some of the publications if anyone wants to know where they are after the talk. So what's the role of Sweden in delivering on the Paris commitment? And then I'm going to actually use a few of the slides that I'll be using tomorrow, later on, just to sort of try and outline why I think the development proposed here is not compatible with Paris. But I'll be interested in your feedback on those slides, because you know this area and you know the development much better than I do. I'm going to start off with the Paris Agreement, which hopefully you're all familiar with. So I don't have to really go into this. And I'm going to read all the stuff. Anyway, broadly, it says to hold to 2 degrees centigrade and ideally aim for 1.5. And that's what the Paris Agreement has laid out for us, and Sweden has committed to that. It's also committed to do it in accordance with the best science, which is broadly captured in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But remember, that science is rightly conservative. It always has to use the sort of consensus of what we understand. So often there is science that has come out more recently that might point one direction or the other, but we're not really certain it's that robust yet. So it is quite rightly conservative. It also has in the Paris Agreement that we have to make our reductions on the basis of equity, and no country in the world has taken that seriously. We don't take it seriously between countries. So the UK and the UK's Climate Change Act, the Swedish Climate Change Law, the new law in the EU, they completely ignore equity between countries, but they also ignore equity within countries. And I will come back to that later on. I think it's a key issue, the issue of equity now. So this presentation, I've taken the Paris Agreement at face value, and in Sweden that should be fairly obvious. I mean, Swedes they're not cynical, they may be sceptical. I've never yet met a cynical Swede. In Britain we're very cynical, so they don't trust anything we say. So I'm assuming that Sweden has signed the Paris Agreement and they have signed it honestly. I'm taking the science and the equity, they're the asset and the components of the Paris Agreement I'm going to focus on. I'm ignoring political and economic sensibilities. I might just try and just turn this around a bit. No. That's a little bit better. So I'm ignoring political and economic sensibilities, so I don't really care about the short-term concerns of the policymakers or businesses or indeed of individuals. I'm not interested in those. I'm interested in what the science and the equity says about these issues. And if you have a focus on these things, then it recasts the whole story as something that is much more challenging than is ever captured in things like the climate law. And I would also argue that much of academia has not been and continues not to be honest about the scale of the challenge that we have. Not when you give them a microphone or ask them to write something down. Talk to academics over a beer and you get a very different story to what we say publicly. What I'm going to talk about today is based on a range of papers. The first paper, which is not actually out in circulation yet, but it is in press, so it will be out sometime hopefully in the next few weeks, which actually focuses on what the Paris Agreement means for Sweden and the UK. So it focuses on those two particular countries. But then there's also a range of other papers that I've published that relates to what I'm talking about today. So if you want this, you can have that. I put that slide in for tomorrow, actually, just for the court case. I work on mitigation, on reducing emissions, and I work on reducing emissions from energy. Agricultural emissions are important. About 20% of global warming, if you like, the warming that we see roughly comes from agriculture. 80%-ish from energy, roughly 20%-ish from agriculture. It's hugely important. We can reduce it, but we cannot eliminate the emissions from agriculture. We can change our diets, we can change our agricultural practices, but you will always get some methane and some N2O emissions from fertiliser, even if you use organic fertiliser. So you cannot eliminate the emissions from agriculture, but you can eliminate the emissions from energy, and that's one of the reasons we have to from energy. I don't work on impacts, but I'm just going to touch on this, and this is probably something you all know about anyway. On impacts, let's first acknowledge that the Paris Agreement is not fair. Even the 1.5 is not just. People are being impacted around the world today, in Mozambique, in the coastal strip of Bangladesh, and elsewhere in the world, at 1 degree of warming. And we had the first IPCC report, which I'll come back to later, was in 1990. So the Paris Agreement is aimed for 1.5 to 2. That's about the best that we can do. I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know how we would hold to 1.5. We can just hold to 2, I think. But neither of those are fair on the poorer parts of the world. People in Mozambique and elsewhere have been affected already by the climate change we're seeing. Even at 1.5 degrees, according to the latest IPCC report, we will destroy about 75% of the barrier reef, and other major emblematic ecosystems will be very, very seriously affected. At 2 degrees, the barrier reef is almost all gone. So it's really destructive, even at these temperatures. We are changing the future for our own children, and we have knowingly done that and continue to do that. And our children, people elsewhere and other species are suffering, and they will die even at 1.5. So we are not talking about a just world. We're talking about a world that already is going to be changing very significantly. So we are changing the future for all future generations of every species. So I'm going to focus now on mitigation, as I say, with a focus on energy. And I'll start off by asking us what the IPCC tells us about the Paris Agreement. And I should say I used to design and build these things. I used to work offshore in the oil platforms in the North Sea on the UK side. So that was a previous life of mine. So the IPCC, you've all heard of the IPCC. Has anyone not heard of the IPCC? Intergovernmental Panel on Climate. I know you have. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now it produces these reports every few years that are really good reports, particularly the science one and the impacts one, less so the one on mitigation, on reducing emissions. And I'm going to summarise the whole of the science in one line, which is a little bit unfair because there's a lot of very good detailed work in there. And that what matters are carbon budgets, the total amount of carbon dioxide that we emit, not some long-term target, not 2030 or 2045, the Swedish climate law, or 2050 for the UK, or 2050 for the EU. They're not, those dates don't matter. It's the total amount of carbon dioxide we emit. So when we look at any project or policy, we have to compare that against the total amount of carbon dioxide. So when you're comparing the development here, it has to look at the total emissions, not what it's going to do in 2030. So just to give a feel for that, this is our years here, and the emissions out there is the area under the curve, the total amount we emit. And if in the short term we expand our land at airport, or we have a new refinery development, then that means the emissions go up, and that means our children have to reduce the emissions more, if that's possible. And I'm going to show that will not be possible. So whatever we do now has to be compensated for elsewhere, or in time in this case. So if you look at the latest IPCC report, and you'll have to take my word for this, but you can ask me about it in more detail if you want. If you look at 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade and focus on the energy part of this, then the amount of carbon dioxide you can emit is round about 650 billion tonnes of CO2. That probably means very little to most of you, but that's about, at the moment, we emit about 37 billion tonnes a year from energy. So that's about 18 years, energy and industry. It's about 18 years of current emissions. And that's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can put in the atmosphere for a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees centigrade and a pretty low chance of staying below 1.5. You'd have to be very lucky on the climate science if you're going to stay below 1.5. I think you have to be fairly lucky to stay below 2, to be honest. But that's roughly how much we can emit. And it may well turn out that that's actually too much, but that's our best guess at the moment, or best estimate. But before we start to sort of say about, well, what can we do about this? We need to understand where we are today. And I think most of us, including academics, are not honest about where we are now. And I think that when you think about the position we're in 2020, it makes you stop and think, actually, this is much worse than we're normally told, or than we want to think. The first IPCC report came out in 1990. I'm looking around here, and not all of some of you were quite clearly here in 1990. Some of you were here a few years before that, like me and a few others. But quite a few of you here weren't born in 1990. And quite a few of you, your parents were probably still at school in 1990. So think throughout all of your lives and your parents' adult life, we have known everything we needed to know about climate change to act on it. 1990 is 30 years ago, 3 decades. The emissions, that's wrong, it's been recalculated now. The emissions now are 62% higher than they were in 1990. So the first report came out, they're now globally 62% higher, and in 2018 they went up again by about 1.6%. Last year we're not 100% certain yet, we're just looking for the data. It'll either be roughly static or possibly very slightly up, but not coming down. So what we've had is 30 years of lots of optimism, but no actual action on climate change. Not that's brought emissions down. Emissions have just been going up and up. And you often hear the language, isn't Sweden showing leadership? I hear this in the UK all the time. I hear it actually more in the UK than in Sweden, but you often hear this, isn't Sweden showing leadership on these issues? Well, here we have the climate law from the climate policy framework, and you often hear in Sweden talk about emissions are 30% lower than they were in 1990. In the UK, the number is often 44% that is used, and yet when you look at, if you include aviation and shipping, and imports and exports, so that computer was made in China. I'm using it over here in Sweden, and we usually blame the Chinese for the emissions. But if we take the fact that actually that was made there, and also that we export things as well from Sweden, then we take all those into account, Sweden has seen no reduction in any meaningful sense since 1990. So one of the most progressive countries in the world, if not in some respects the most progressive country in the world, has made no reduction in its emissions since the first set of IPCC reports in 1990. And the UK is slightly better actually. The UK has come down by about 10%, significantly because of austerity in the banking crisis, but also because we've closed our coal-fired power stations, which of course you don't have here. So the UK has made a little reduction, but almost none. And if you go across the whole of the EU, you'll often hear almost every country telling you how well they're doing, but look at the numbers and they aren't. Basically, the EU has had almost no reduction, 10% or so. And there's a whole set of reasons why we have failed and yet why we think we've succeeded. Offsetting. Yeah, it's like trying to lose weight by asking a poor person to cut back on the chocolate. It's not going to work. You have to cut back on the food yourself. You can't expect someone else to do it. But what we're getting here is rich countries, high-emitting countries, are paying poorer countries to reduce their emissions, and we're carrying on. And then we sanction that in what's called the Clean Development Mechanism. Once you give something a nice name, it sounds official. It sounds like it's been well thought through. It's just another scam, another fraud. Swindlery, is that the right word in Swedish? Afforestation, already being used again in Sweden. I've heard that argument being made for the expansion of Arlanda airport. You can plant more trees in the north of Sweden to allow us to fly more. And then when all of that fails, and I'll come back to this in a bit more detail later, we're going to rely on the next generation, on the younger people here, I mean that they will have to do this, to suck our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future. Virtually every model from 2050 onwards, sometimes even earlier than that, assumes that our children will suck huge quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which allows us to carry on with our behaviour today. And that's embedded in virtually every single climate, not the climate model, the models about what we should do about it. There's two sets of models. There's the climate models, which are basically just lots and lots of physics, complicated, just lots of physics. And then there's the other models, which are the ones what we should do about it, and they've got lots of economics in there, or astrology, depending how you view economics. And what's worrying here is that all of these are embedded in the Swedish climate law. So your new climate law embeds all of these in it. And when all of these fail, we're already getting economists and engineers now looking at geoengineering. That's ways that we can engineer the planet. So they're looking, one of the ways they're looking at doing this is to fire rockets into the stratosphere to spread out sulfur particles that then will reflect the sunlight into space to keep the Earth cooler. And we're already looking at these things. Perhaps we should be looking at them. But economists are saying, actually, it's cheaper to do that, some economists, than actually reducing our emissions. What we haven't done in 30 years is try to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. So we've tried everything else, but we haven't tried to cut our carbon dioxide. So what we've got here is failure writ large, so failure at every single level on climate change. That's not to say some people haven't tried hard, some people have. There have been some really good, very small examples here and there, but at a collective level, we have fundamentally failed, and we have to recognise that. And I'm going to base the rest of the talk on Leonard Cohen. Did anyone over the age of 40 will have heard of Leonard Cohen? Anyone below the age of 40 thought, who knows that old man? Leonard Cohen he's a poet. Sadly, he died 2 years ago, I think, maybe 3. He's a poet and a singer, and he wrote some really wonderful songs. So, regardless of your age, I would recommend listening to Leonard Cohen. But probably when you're in a reasonable mood, because they're quite depressing songs. But he wrote these lyrics for his song called Anthem, which I think is a wonderful lyric, and you can use it for lots of things, but I'm going to use it here for thinking about the rest of the talk. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. So ring the bells that still can ring. What I'm thinking about here, there are plenty of things that we know what to do today. We're not waiting for engineers, we're not waiting for new inventions, we're not waiting for other things in the future. We can be doing these things today. We should have been doing them for 30 years ago. Passive house standards. So when you build a house, it requires no heating. In Uppsala, where I work a lot of my time now, they're expanding Uppsala at a really fast rate. Almost none of the buildings are passive house. Almost every one you will have to heat. So there's no reason for that. It only costs a little bit more money to do that. Have a maximum standard on cars. Why is it we're still seeing huge Volvos being driven around in Sweden? I mean, really high emissions, probably 150 to 200 grams per kilometre in actual, in real life. Eat less meat and dairy. No airport expansion. No new road building. Solar on all buildings. No, there should be no new buildings put up in Sweden that do not include solar panels. What I'm saying for Sweden here, I'm not picking on Sweden. I could say the same thing for the UK, even more for the UK. Our houses in the UK are really bad, much, much worse than yours. I always jokingly say that a Swedish tent is about as efficient as a British house. And an Irish colleague of mine tells me that a British tent is as efficient as an Irish house. So I don't know what they are like. But what I'm saying, no second homes. That's a radical idea for Swedes. Imagine that, no second homes. Because what are they? Second homes have equipment in them. They're places that sometimes people could live. They often have water, electricity supplied to them. They'll have a fridge, sometimes have a television, they have light, they have all of that stuff there, a whole lot of extra material. And Swedes love their second homes. And they've got to drive to them in your large Volvo. So there's a whole set of things here that we know what to do and we should have been doing for years. And there are lots more than this as well. So we should be getting on with those now. Now there are lots of perfect offerings out there, normally from sort of officials of one sort or another. We had the Stern report, which some of you might have heard about in 2006 by an economist, quite a famous economist. And to his credit, he did question something called discounting, which economists, or this particular type of economists, use all the time. And that's how they discount the costs of things in the future. So technology in the future is always much cheaper than doing something today. And that's embedded in all the models. And he questioned that. That was very brave of him. But the rest of the numbers in that report are rubbish. The number on the emissions were going up much faster than he was prepared to accept there. I often say with economists, the only numbers they should be allowed to use are page numbers. And it's a particular type of economist. But I think Stern deserves credit for questioning the concept of discounting. There's the IPCC report. I have a lot of time with the IPCC, but I think Working Group 3 looks at what we should do about climate change. So it's innately political. It can't help but be political. Responding to climate change, reducing our emissions, is a political issue. And I don't think we should therefore pretend there's a best way of doing it. And virtually every single model in here, almost every model that they use in this report, relies on a huge amount of negative emissions, lots and lots of technologies in the future, and virtually none of those models embed any real major social change. So it's all about how you pass it on. The new net zero report, this language of net zero, have any of you heard of this? Is that big? Yeah. In the UK it's really big, in Europe now, the EU law, it wasn't there. Look, 5 years ago, no one was talking about net zero. Now it's everywhere. And you should see it as not zero, would be more accurate. or I would say net is Latin for let's leave it for the next generation. So we've got the new let's leave it to the next generation report for the UK, and then of course we've got the Swedish one. Now normally I would say Sweden is a much more progressive country than the UK, but the Swedish climate change law is nowhere near as good as the 2008 Climate Change Act in the UK. The UK's Climate Change Act in 2008 was broadly consistent with what a scientific framing would be for guiding a country towards reducing its emissions. The problem is that we've assumed a very, very large carbon budget, very British. We think we should have a bigger part of the pie. But the framework was much better, and the Swedes produced their really pretty rubbish law 10 years later was a disgrace. And Sweden should have shown some leadership there. So what these laws are wrapped up with is colonialism. Nice liberal people basically saying we want in the West, in the UK and Sweden, a much larger slice of the carbon pie than is really fair. So I always sort of say that we stole their slaves, we stole their minerals, and now we're stealing their carbon budget, because that's what we're doing in these rich parts of the world. And then we don't even then live within that budget. We then say, and our children will solve the problem for us. So the whole thing is wrapped up in colonialism and then passing the buck to the next generation. It's effectively a greenwash for business as usual. So we're just saying we'll make some small changes. Climate change, you can just bolt it on to business as usual and it will be fine, because it won't be. So the next question I want to ask is, how loud do the bells need to ring on climate change? And this is going to be a bit tricky because there's some graphs here and some numbers and you probably can't see them. So I'll go through this quite quickly. But basically, before Paris, we were heading towards something like 4 to 6 degrees centigrade of warming. If you looked at the way the emissions were going up, if we carried on like that, from the early 2000s, they were rising about 3% every year, something like that, then you'd be seeing a 4 to 6 degrees centigrade of warming across the century, there or thereabouts. Could be a bit later, could even be a bit earlier, but it's a fundamentally different planet. It's nothing like the one that we live on, if you saw that, occurring almost overnight. Remember, 100 years is nothing in an ecosystem point of view, and even in human society point of view, it's not a great deal, really. With the Paris Agreement, what we saw was the emissions pathway that we had was more in line with 3 to 4 degrees centigrade. And a lot of that was actually due to the banking crisis. It wasn't really due to very clever climate policies. So every country in the world submitted their pledge, their promise to Paris to say, well, what we will do. And when you add them all up, you've got something like 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming, which is still nothing like the planet that we would recognise. So all the science tells us that's not a place to go. As I said before, we've got about 650 billion tonnes there or thereabouts from the energy system, and it looks more like that blue curve, which is, for those of you who can't see it, we were doing that, we then are doing this, and we need to do that. That's basically what the slide's saying. And really, we need to be zero carbon energy by 2050 at the outside. Remember, this is not for 1.5, this is for 2 degrees centigrade by about 2050. But we also promised, with our fingers crossed behind our backs, I think, we also promised to take account of equity, which means that the rich countries will show leadership in delivering on Paris. And it actually has that in the Paris Agreement, how it would take longer for the poor countries to peak and therefore reach their final zero emissions. So that's embedded in the Paris Agreement, that we should have that. So it looks different when you play that out for the wealthy countries, and I'll come back to that soon. But what we saw in Paris and what we see repeatedly are these sort of good stories about how we're doing a lot, we're moving in the right direction. And why is it we get these sorts of stories when you look at what I'm laying out here? It's completely different. It's all based on the same science, it's all based on the IPCC, and it's just arithmetic, it's just maths. It's not really much more than adding, multiplying, dividing and subtracting, a little bit more, but not much more. So, but the policymakers have received a very different story, and they've been pleased to receive a different story as well. So remember, they're looking for a nicer story, and us academics have been quite happy to give them a nicer story, provided we get some funding back. So there's sort of like a relationship there, which is not deliberate, but it has emerged. And the advice they receive is dominated by a particular group of modelers. Now, I'm not going into details here, but they're called integrated assessment modelers. There's a small sets of these modelling groups around the wealthy parts of the world, not very many of them, because they're very expensive to run these models. So they're generally wealthier people in wealthier parts of the world running models about what we should do about climate change. And think about it, that's wealthy people in wealthier parts of the world with high emissions asking what we should do about climate change. So there are some, it does leave you some concern. And then they're not only economic models, but they're dominated by economics with some science in there and some engineering as well. And then the mitigation rate, the reduction rate for what they're suggesting is much less challenging. It's much more appealing. So what we see is that they're saying you can have about 1,500 billion tonnes. So the red line there. If you think if you're a policymaker, which one do you want to sell to your your public, the blue line or the red line? The blue line means you can't go skiing in northern Italy, which perhaps we shouldn't be doing anyway, for other reasons. You can't go to Bali. It means if you're an academic, you can't keep flying around the world telling little people elsewhere what they should do about climate change. It begs fundamental questions about how we live our lives. The red line says you can carry on as normal, or almost as normal. So which one would you think is more appealing? It's obviously the red one, and that's what we see. It dominates all the discussions. So what we see actually is the science saying we've got roughly 650 billion tonnes, give or take 10 or 20%, and we've got the more economic-based models saying we've got something like 1,500 billion tonnes. That's a median value from the IPCC scenario. So there's a big difference. So how is it that makes sense? How can you make sense of that? Has anyone seen this film? Dr. Strangelove. There are 2 films I recommend on climate change. One is Dr. Strangelove, which is just wonderful. And for those that haven't heard of it, it's not directly about climate change. It's about particular types of men and belief in technology. So, but it is really important to understand, I think, how we are responding to climate change. And the other one is Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's Merchants of Doubt. That's fantastic, and that film is about climate change. So how is it then we managed to hold these 2 sets of numbers together? And it's because we have really, and this isn't meant to sound flippant, I actually think this is happening. We have been pulling rabbits out of hats, like magicians. We've been doing this for quite a lot of years now. And initially there was some good reasoning for it, but unfortunately it's just gone on and on. So what we've done, we've conjured up this concept of negative emission technologies. We give it an acronym, NETS, or BECS, or CDI. You give it a nice scientific sounding name. And then you think, I can go and buy one of those from the shops in the supermarket. I'll be able to solve the problem with this magical technology that doesn't exist in any scale. And these technologies are going to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future. And they normally start about 2035, but they're really going from 2050 to 2100. Now, what do you think the modelers will be doing in 2050? They'll be either pushing up the daisies or retired in Tuscany. They won't be part of the problem anymore. They'll have caused the problem, or been party to their causing the problem, and they've retired. And I think we have to think about how humans do what we do when we ask who should do the models, and think about that. What they're doing is having the emissions going way below zero, right to the end of the century. But what's worrying, you look at most of the models, and it carries on after the end of the century. So it's not only our children who are asking to do this, but our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren are embedded in the models to say they will have to suck the CO2 out because we aren't prepared to phase out a lot of flying from our airports, or drive smaller cars, or not heat all of our homes. And I'm talking about the wealthy ones of us, and I'll come back to that again later. So let's take out the generational buck passing. Let's pretend that negative emission technologies, or let's just assume they won't work at scale. Now, I will say that I think we should research negative emission technologies. I think we should spend quite a lot of money researching them and put a lot of effort into them, and let's hope they will work. If we do everything we can for 2 degrees centigrade, and the negative emission technologies work, which doesn't look very likely, but if they did work, then we'd have an outside chance of 1.5. The problem is we're using the negative emission technologies to avoid 2, and to avoid a lot of the 3 degree C scenarios also have all these in there. So there's a really dangerous way that we're addressing these issues. So let's take all that out and then say, well, okay, if we were honest about this, what would Sweden's fair share be for delivering on Paris? And here it's all about pies, or bulla if you're Swedish. Manchester people like pies. What we have is a carbon pie. That's the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can pump in the atmosphere across the century, and in fact beyond the end of the century. And we know roughly what it looks like. It could be a bit bigger if we're lucky on climate sensitivity. It's more likely to be a bit smaller because we think some of the other feedbacks are going to make the situation worse. And that's about 650 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide that I talked about earlier, there or thereabouts. And then the real difficult bit is, well, okay, if we've got a pie, that's a rationing issue. How do you divide the pie out evenly or fairly? How much should Sweden get? How much should Ghana get? Nigeria get? China get? Indonesia get? How much do different parts of the world get? And you can imagine the negotiations for that would be really difficult. And this is actually one of the reasons that the new EU law does not include a carbon budget. I was speaking to the advisor, the carbon advisor, climate change advisor, to the new president of the EC just 2 weeks ago when I was coming up here. I stopped off to speak to them and said the reason they haven't got a carbon budget in the new EU law is if they put a budget in, they then know that you've got to divide it amongst every member state in the EU. And they said that would be an impossible job. So they can't have a budget in because the politics, they say, is stopping them. But you have to do this. And so what we've done with our colleagues in Uppsala, with Isaac and some others and other colleagues in Manchester, we've said, how much should it look like for the EU? Or how much should it look like for the wealthy part of the world? Now, how do you divide the pie up? You think about it, how would you divide it? You could divide it on population, you could divide it on your historical emissions, your current emissions, the size of your economy, your capacity to respond to climate change. There are all different ways you could divide the pie. So we looked at those and then thought, okay, what are the best ways of doing that, the fairest ways? And we've got a range of those. And you come up with a slice, or you came up with a range of slices for the wealthy countries. And then we take these slices and we say, how much should Sweden get? And again, you have a choice. You know, does Sweden get it just on population, or does it get it on its historical emissions or its current emissions? And then you get a range from that as well. And then when we've worked this out for Sweden, and this includes aviation and shipping, but it doesn't include the imports and exports. Okay? Again, these numbers, for most of you, won't mean a lot. But it's somewhere between 280 and 370 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. That's what Sweden can emit to make its fair contribution to something like a 2 degree C warming, hopefully a little bit lower than 2 degrees centigrade. That's about 6 to 8 years of current emissions, depending quite how you measure it. 6 to 8 years of current emissions, and that's the budget you would have. And we've worked this out for the UK, which obviously gets a bigger budget, because it's a much bigger country, bigger population, bigger historical emissions, a whole set of reasons. But very similar sets of arguing why Sweden should get this and we should get what we get in the UK. But it's about the same rate of reduction, very similar. And we're doing this now for every country. We've also worked one out for the European Union, which we submitted prior to the EU law. So now I want to convert that into, well, what rate of reduction does that mean? Because for most of us, that doesn't mean a lot, you know, the sort of total amount of carbon dioxide you can emit. What does that mean then? For Sweden, it's about a 12 to 15% reduction in emissions every year. And you start to think about this relative to the new proposal here. Every year, 12 to 15%. That starts on January the 1st, 2020. So we're 6 weeks late? What we know? We're more than that now, aren't we? 8 weeks late. So we're already 8 weeks behind. My guess is Sweden doesn't come down at anything significant. So we're already failing. And remember, because it's a cumulative problem, going back to that bit at the beginning, every day you fail, it gets harder the next day. That's a total reduction in emissions for Sweden, for all of its energy, of around about 70 to 75% by 2030, within a decade. And that means fully decarbonised and with zero carbon energy, planes, trains, ships, industry, households, cars, everything, zero carbon by about 2035 to 2040. For Sweden, it's probably nearer to 2035. For Greece and slightly poor countries, probably nearer to 2040. And in this, we've also made some assumptions about the poorer parts of the world. They get a little bit longer to do this. They get to about the early 2050s to do this. So there's a bit of a gap. And this sounds almost impossible, but we should have started earlier. We chose to fail. Those of us who are high emitters that understood these issues, and that's a lot of us out there, we chose to fail for 30 years. So, you know, this is what happens. If you choose to fail, eventually we have to face this. We've enjoyed emitting for the last 30 years, and this is what we've got left. So what I want to do now is just think about this new development here. And you're going to know much more about this than me. So if I'm saying anything wrong here, please correct me, because I had quite limited information to go on and not a lot of time to pull my thoughts together on this. So we've got Preems development. Now the question for me is, does Preems development align with Sweden's Paris commitments? So that's the question I'm asking, and it's a reasonable question to ask, and some maths for that. So, as far as I can gather what's what I've been told, there are no really clear numbers from Preem related to their plan. There are some numbers, but there are not a lot of really detailed numbers out there. And if that's wrong, then I'll be pleased to know quite quickly, because that's what I'm working on for tomorrow. So I've been told, I think that their permit is for 11.2 million tonnes of oil equivalent to actually go through this particular plant here. And they say that they only use at the moment about 95.7% of their permit they use, and they have said they will not use any more of that permit. So, okay, then we multiply 11.2 it is by 96%, you get 10.9 million tonnes. So I'm deliberately doing this in a conservative way, so they can't say we're exaggerating things. And I've been told, that they're going to take about 20% of that, which they currently use primarily for making marine fuel, the really thick, black, gunky stuff at the end. They're going to take that, and then they're going to convert that now through a process into petrol and diesel, and some other things. You're going to get naphtha out of it and a bit of gas and so forth. And probably about 2% of what they convert will still stay as, will now be low sulfur bunker fuels. So that's about 2.2 million tonnes of oil equivalent. Well, it's going to be now converted into petrol and diesel. So that's that's the what's saying there about naphtha, diesel, and heavy oil. Naphtha, which again you may know about, naphtha is often used as a diluent to put with heavier oil to make it flow better in pipes. Hopefully, petrol and diesel. I think you know what they are. So I've had to use, because I didn't have any real data, I've just assumed some basic calculations, basic assumptions here, that what they're converting is relatively normal crude. So typical crude is not a sweet crude, it's not a sour crude, it's an average crude oil you're converting. And if you do the calculations here with a sort of sense check on this, that means that if you burnt this extra, well, this 20% here, you'd get about 4.5 to 5.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. Now, what they're focusing on, as I understand it, is actually the emissions from operating the plant. But the climate doesn't give a damn about the emissions from operating the plant. The climate only cares about the total amount of CO2. It doesn't care about accountancy practices, it doesn't care about your politics, it just looks at the amount of CO2 you spew in the air. So you can't ignore the fact is that people will burn the petrol and diesel. So that has to be part of the question. Now, if you assume that you're going to build this, I assume they're not going to build it for a week. I assume they're going to run it for a few years. So then let's assume it runs for 20 years. And let's assume anyway, at least to start off with, for that 20 years, it's just going to use it for heavy fuel oil to make petrol and diesel. And maybe it swaps to biomass in 10 years or 15 years' time, who knows? But let's imagine it just runs for 20 years. Then that's 90 to 100 million tonnes, 110 million tonnes of carbon dioxide. If it ran for just 10 years, it'd be half that amount, so it'd still be a huge amount. And remember the numbers I said before? What was the carbon budget for Sweden? So now you've got the numbers that come out of the plant over just 20 years. Maybe it runs for 30 years. I mean, who knows how long it runs for? They haven't told us. So we know how long it's, well, we don't know how long it's going to run. We assume it's going to run for some period of time, and we know what the budget is. So the question then is, if you look at what and I think they've said this in a number of places, and I can't speak Swedish, so my Swedish colleague, I will blame him. This is all Isaac's fault. Isaac's an excellent colleague, but basically he's taken the Swedish, and what they refer to quite a lot in their literature is alternatives. So basically, to convert that into a language I can understand, they're basically saying that there are considerably worse alternatives for producing crude oil than elsewhere in the world than if we did it in Sweden. In other words, we're better off to do it in Sweden. So that's an argument they're making. So it's an alternative. Our alternative is better than theirs. And the second time they're also saying this, then they're saying the point quite clearly here that actually Preems emissions per tonne of useful petrol or diesel, whatever it might be, are lower than those for elsewhere. Not from when you burn it, for making it. And so they're saying, therefore, the emissions from other refineries are higher. And again, they're referring to these as alternatives. So they're saying that our emissions, if you don't have the other, if we use ours rather than theirs, then there'll be less emissions. But is that true? Is it an alternative? So the question then, is it an alternative or is it in addition to? And that's what really matters from a climate point of view. Is it adding to what we already do, or is it going to be something else? So you can then ask some sort of simple questions. On supply and demand, just basic, page 101 in the economics, which is very standard stuff. If you produce more supply of a rare commodity, like petrol or diesel, you produce more of it, then generally, other things being equal, the price will drop a little bit. If the price drops, then usually the demand goes up a little bit. And that's exactly what we see with fuel consumption data. We've seen this for years and years, decades now. As the price goes up and down, what you actually see is both people start to burn more, they travel further, and they also buy bigger or smaller cars. There's really clear evidence in the US on this as well. If it just goes down a little bit, the price of fuel, people buy bigger cars. And then we also drive further. So there's a supply-demand bit. If we supply some more fuel, then we will put the price down and it will consume more, and the climate up there will look down and say, I see more carbon dioxide, I'll give you some additional warming. So it's only relevant if Preem then decide, and you can tell me if they're doing this, they've got to go into the rest of Europe or elsewhere in the world, they've got to buy up a refinery and close it down. Now, if they're not doing that, it's additive. It just makes the situation worse. So only if they're going to close other ones down, and I don't know, I mean, hopefully they'll tell me tomorrow, yeah, we've bought these ones in Nigeria and Belgium, we're going to close them down. But my guess is that's not what they're doing at all. So that would work to some extent. And that would mean you maintain the supply at the current levels, which is the sort of argument they're making. But it's not an argument, because an argument has reason and thinking behind it. So, but the problem is, even if you did do this, even if you did buy this refinery, you would still fail. Because Paris doesn't say, we want to maintain emissions at current levels. Paris says we've got to reduce emissions in line with 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. In other words, we've got to reduce emissions in Sweden at 12 to 15% every single year. So even the best reading of Preem, if they did go out somewhere else in the world and close that refinery, that would just be maintaining emissions, it's not bringing them down. And so, however Preem argue it, and as best I can see it, you cannot reconcile Preem's development with Paris. They're incompatible. I can't see a way out of that. Maybe there is, but I can't see it. So based on Sweden's Paris-compliant carbon budget, which we've worked out, and we can give all the reasoning for why it is what it is, then given the fact we have very little information from Preem, at least that's my understanding, the best that I can do is say that Preem's extra development here represents somewhere between 24 and 40% of Sweden's total carbon budget for the rest of the century. Now that's a huge proportion. And remember that the Swedish climate law has nothing to do with Paris. So this is, I'm saying here, what's necessary for Paris, not for the climate law in Sweden. So then you come to, if you want a quantitative and sort of reasoned assessment, the choice you have to come to is one where you give the permit. So you say, yes, let's go ahead with the permit and let's reject the Paris Agreement. And that would be an honest position. And if Sweden wants to do that, that's an honest, I don't think it's particularly good for the climate or our own children's future. If we say actually the short-term benefits to us is more important than our children's future, then let's forget Paris, let's reject it, and let's develop this extra refining capacity. That's a reasonable, honest position that people can argue about one way or another. Or it has to reject the development and then reshape the rest of Sweden's economy in line with what's necessary for the Paris Agreement. And I can't see option C there anywhere. I don't think there's another option, but I could be wrong. But actually, when you start to think about this, it means much more than that. So I think, in this sense, Preem have sort of opened up a Pandora's box, because not only is Preem's proposed expansion incompatible with Paris, but in the medium to long term, so is their refinery. So it's not that we shouldn't just stop, or it's not that it's not that whoever goes ahead and decides to go with it or not, shouldn't just say no to the expansion. Actually, if you're going to say no to the expansion on the basis of the Paris Agreement, you then have to think, well, hang on a second, what about the rest of it? What about the rest of the refinery? So I think then you say that if Sweden is going to maintain its progressive reputation, then the refinery needs to phase out of all fossil fuel use by about 2030. So it needs to phase that out. But that can't be just done. And given I come from the oil industry, I still have friends and colleagues working, well, friends working in the oil industry. You've got to think about how do you do that fairly? Because there's lots of people working in these industries. And you can't just close it down and they have no jobs. That's what we did in Britain with the mines years ago, the coal mines. And the communities still haven't recovered. So you've got to think in detail, what does that mean? And so what you have to have is what are the skills that are used by the people in the refinery, and how do we use those to help us make the transition to a low carbon future? And most of the time, from my experience of people working in the oil industry, they've got a huge skill set that are massively important in making the move to a zero carbon future. So it's not as if we're short of tasks and jobs for them to do. There are plenty of jobs if we are serious about our Paris commitment. So that's the bit about Preem. I don't know if you've got any comments on any of the numbers or anything, if I'm missing some major arguments there, then please let me know about that. But that's roughly what I'll be saying, that bit there, tomorrow. So if there are big faults, let me know now. Back to the main presentation and Leonard Cohen. So the argument is, his lyric here is there's a crack in everything. I mean, the third lyric was there's a crack out there. Now what do these cracks look like? I was coming back from one of the COPs a few years ago, and it was really depressing, the one in Bonn. And I was on a train back up to Sweden and just thinking, well, what's the point of doing this? I may as well go rock climbing and cycling. Not that I do either at the moment with my ankle. But, so I was thinking, what's better? What are good things out there? And I thought, actually, the banking crisis. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but that was a huge shift in the global economy that we hadn't envisaged happening. If you went back to 2006, and some of you probably are young enough not to really remember this, but if you went back to 2006 and said to your Chancellor of the Exchequer, to your Finance Minister, we want you to sign a cheque out for, say, half the size of your economy to pump back into the banks to keep the banks alive next week and next year, they would never have done it. They would have thought you were a fool. The following year, we had a global banking crisis that did exactly that. Even the coronavirus now, who would have thought we'd just be closing down a whole of northern Italy and huge swathes of China, and we're talking about that in other parts of the world now? You wouldn't have thought that possible, 6 months ago. Social media. People of my age, we had no idea that social media was coming. Even if you go back 10 years, I think we really wouldn't understand where social media is today. And there were lots of bad things, there were lots of terrible things about social media, but there were also lots of wonderful things about it as well. We can all have a voice in social media. Think of the old media was run and owned either by governments or usually a small group of rich white men. They ran the news for the last 100 years, newspapers as well. Now, it may be a bit different in Sweden, but certainly in the UK and many parts of the world, it's been run like that. And now everyone else can join in. You can get, in Britain, we get 60 million nutters tweeting. But you've got a choice between 4 rich white men owning it in the UK, the newspapers, or 60 million nutters. And I would take the 60 million nutters every time. But then there's a job for us as the users of social media and all forms of media to be discerning. We have to be careful about what we're reading, think about it, not just take it as given. So there's a relationship with social media that we have to develop to make it worthwhile. But who would have guessed that a few years ago? A complete change in the way we communicate. Who would have thought that Brexit and Trump would happen? Go back 7, 8 years ago, could you imagine the US being run by an orange gentleman and the UK pulling out of the EU? The Arab Spring. I mean, it turned out to be a disaster in many respects, though there's some talk about there might be first signs of a second Arab Spring. But that was a huge shift that people did not think would happen in these very authoritarian countries and with a lot of oppression. You saw this huge coming out on the streets of a lot of normal people, and it's true, a lot of people died as a consequence. And maybe not wonderful things have come out of it, but it looks like there's still some change there. The price of renewables, it just keeps coming down. Even if you went back 5 years ago, most people who worked on renewables would not think the price was where it is today, and it's not come to the bottom, it's still going down. So it's destabilising the energy market anyway. And then we've even got organisations like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is not a left-wing organisation, it's a sort of fairly right-wing, fairly sort of, well, centrist and right-wing organisation, saying, well, actually fossil fuels are really problematic from a health point of view, and pointing out how the subsidies in 2015, in the year of the Paris Agreement, to fossil fuels, the direct and indirect subsidy was $5.3 trillion. 5.3, that's more than any subsidy we're ever going to give to the renewables. So there are lots of cracks out there. The cracks aren't going to solve the problem, that's where the light gets in. And what does the light look like? Well, and I will be a bit of a groan from Swedes about this probably, but Greta Thunberg is to me, is a shard of light. Now, she's not going to solve climate change. She doesn't think she's going to solve climate change, but she's helped change the debate. And she's also helped to catalyse a whole wonderful youth movement. So they're all having their voices heard. And those voices aren't all the same, but they're having their voices heard. They are starting to change the debate. You've all got people like Extinction Rebellion, which is a really interesting group of people from all sorts of backgrounds. I still think culturally it's interesting that in the UK there's some discussion about it culturally, but nevertheless it's an incredible a wide group of people coming together and changing the debate, opening up questions that we could not ask before. So there's lots of things happening there. The whole idea of flight shame, which has affected some of the numbers in Sweden, probably not as much as the coronavirus, but and it has also in the UK. And I prefer to see it. I gather this is not a proper translation, but I prefer to see it as flight consciousness or awareness rather than necessarily shame. But you can argue about that. So and these aren't going to solve the problem, but they have meant that we can ask different questions. So I think the debate has changed, and that's where the light comes in. So I'm going to come towards the end now. So, well, what do we need to think about if we're going to deliver on Paris? What are the thoughts? What do the actions need to look like? And this is where I come back to the concept of equity here. And I always get told if you have an equation, you lose half the audience. But anyway, hopefully there's one equation is quite straightforward. Paris plus the IPCC equals equity. And that's not a political statement. It's not a moral statement. It's just a math statement. And I think you can show that from just the numbers. Carbon dioxide emissions are massively skewed to a small percentage of the population. At a global level, this has now become quite a well-known curve that some of you here will be familiar with, and the UK looks like this as well. Most of the emissions come from a small group of the population, and we know who they are. 50% of global emissions come from about 10% of the global population, and about 2/3 of that 10% live in the wealthy countries, and 1/3 lives in the poorer countries. Remember, the rich countries, there's only about 1.4 billion people living in them in total. About 70% of emissions from 20% of the population. So you start to think, well, actually, we need to focus on them, don't we? And you regularly hear the question, or the comment, well, there's not that many of them, it doesn't really matter. So the great thing about maths means you can test those questions. So imagine a thought experiment. Just imagine that we thought climate change was a serious issue. Now, okay, you're probably a slightly unusual audience in that probably some of you here think it's a serious issue. But I would argue lots of my climate science colleagues, not all of them, but quite a few of them, don't think it's a serious issue, not if you look at how they're living their lives. So imagine we thought it was a serious issue, and then it was so serious that we had regulations at a global level, one way or another, in each country, that required the top 10% of global emitters to reduce their carbon dioxide footprint to the level of the average European. So not the average Ghanaian or Nigerian or Rwandan, but the average European EU citizen. I mean, is that too much to ask? That top 10%? And that the rest of the 90% make no reductions. So 90% just carry on as normal, and just the 10% reduce to the level of the average European. Now, that's not going to solve climate change, but that gives you a 1/3 cut in global emissions. Woo! And it just shows you where the emissions are massively skewed to a small group. Now, I often say with my students, or even if I'm doing some talks in some places, maybe it's different here, there's something called Pareto's rule, the 80-20 rule, which some of you will have heard about. 80% of the emissions, or whatever it is you're looking at, come from 20% of the population. It can be all sorts of things. So you think about this room here, if you look at the carbon footprint of everyone here, you'll probably find that it's the 80-20 rule, that 20% of you here are responsible for 80% of the emissions of the group. So if you just look around you, you'll spot the high emitters. So, and that holds in many things. It's not always 80-20, but the emissions are massively skewed, like many things in life are as well. So that tells us that, therefore, I think it gives us a clear picture now that we have to have a 3-phase strategy to respond to climate change. It doesn't tell you what the policies will look like in detail, because they look different in Sweden to the UK. They look different in the north of the UK to the south of the UK. They look different in other countries in Europe, or in China, or in Indonesia, or wherever it might be. Each country will develop its policies differently, because they're culturally different countries. We think of things differently. Some people like taxes, some people like regulations, some countries are more uneven than others. But very clearly, you've got to do something in the near term. And this is where Extinction Rebellion have actually been really good. They're bringing the discussion, and some of the youth movements, they're bringing the discussion to what are we doing now and over the next 5 years. Not like the Swedish law, what we're doing in 2045. Retired or dead is what we're doing in 2045. Well, I'm hoping to be here with some stem cell research. But anyway, so some behaviours and practices of the high emitters. We have to focus in this very near term on the high emitters, because you cannot change the technology in 5 years, not even 3 years. I mean, the only thing you can do significant in that period of time is to change the behaviour of people who are the high emitters, and they will not do it voluntarily. I mean, some might, but mostly they won't. So you have to have a regulatory framework or some other mechanism for doing that. But that's not going to solve the problem, but it will bring the emissions down off the curve. And if we don't do that, we fail. But we also need to make sure that everything we do is very, very efficient. So the most efficient laptops and cars and industry equipment and whatever it is we're going to buy, if we are going to use these things, make sure it's the most efficient that's available and that it tightens up every single year. So if you think about that from cars, you would say, if we are going to sell cars, no car over 100 grams to be sold from next week. And then tighten that at 10 grams per every year, 10 grams per kilometre every year. And what you'll hear is you'll hear the financial directors squeal. That's always a good sound. You know you're moving. Because by and large, in the laws of physics, the engineers will broadly deliver if you squeeze the regulations. Regulations are a really good driver of innovation, much more so than taxes. And there's a lot of empirical evidence to support that. But you also, of course, need to move away from fossil fuels. So we've got to have, and I referred to it here for some of the older members, who probably don't remember the Marshall Plan, but maybe the Marshall Plan was the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, which was quite a long time ago. But it was a plan to reconstruct Europe, because basically we destroyed it by fighting each other rather stupidly. So we then had to rebuild all of Europe, and there was a big plan behind it. And that sort of scale of effort, that sort of plan is what we require now. It is not bolt on to the existing system. It's actually now changing the system because we've left it so late. So we've got to do that. We also have to have a massive program of electrification. Even in Sweden, 70% of the energy we consume in Sweden is not electricity. 70%. In most parts of the world, it's 80% is not electricity. We can make zero carbon electricity, but it's quite hard to make any other zero carbon energy. You might have a bit of biofuel, but not a lot that's sustainable. You can have hydrogen, but that's usually produced by electricity, so it's got to be electrification. And what this means is you've got to take the labour, and this is the bit that why no one wants to do it, and why the policy makers won't push it. You've got to take the labour and the resources that furnish the relative luxuries of the high emitters. So people like me, our lives are taking up a lot of labour and a lot of resources, and that labour and resources are required to make the shift to a low carbon energy system. It's not to hand it out to poor people. In this case, it's just to say we need to make a massive public transport system. We need to move away from cars. We need to make sure that all our homes are retrofitted so they're really suitable for the 21st and 22nd century. Every facet of life needs to be improved. And that's a huge physical task that's going to take 20, maybe 30 years. So it's like the shift in productive capacity in World War II. Roosevelt went into the car companies and said to them, I want you to build some tanks and planes. Now, I'm not suggesting we didn't build tanks and planes, but they said, well, you don't understand, we make cars. And he said, well, you do understand, you will not be making cars. And that's the sort of thing we're talking about. You go into the Volvo factory and say, stop making Volvos, make me some trams and some trains. That's the sort of shift in productive capacity we are talking about. It's not bolt on to business as usual. Just to give a flavour of what that means, no more large homes. In fact, large homes really need to be split into smaller homes. Because if you split into smaller homes, you haven't got to build as many other properties. Every time you build a new property, it's more energy, more concrete, more steel, more glass, more materials. Now, we could use some wood, that would make it much better, but overall, we should use the resources we have more efficiently. No more holiday homes, second homes, no more big cars, SUVs, no highly mobile lives, no frequent flyers, no massive levels of consumption. This is by the sort of relatively wealthy in our society, which is a reasonable proportion of people in Sweden, I think. And we need all that effort and energy to go into this shift away from fossil fuels. We need new narratives. We need to rethink, what do we mean by growth, progress and development? It's time that I think it's past time that we rethink about that, but climate change forces us to rethink what those things might be. How do we value things? How do we reward success? I've talked to the students and asked them, why have you come to university? They've come to university for a good time. They've also come to university to get qualification. And why do you want the qualification? So I get a better job. Why do you want a better job? So I get a bigger house, a bigger car, fly further, have a larger carbon footprint. So universities are all about increasing carbon footprints. Is that a reasonable way to run our lives? We need to start to reconfigure what means by value and success. Fundamentally rethink that. We need a better relationship with time. We always focus on the short term now. We need to think about the longer term and also learn a lot more lessons from the past as well. So we need to think about that more. We need to seriously consider the future of our own children and other people's children, and of poorer people elsewhere in the world, so inter- and intergenerational equity. We're not considering those seriously now. And I think we have to have a much deeper appreciation of the modern human world. It's not a different world to the one to our one, we're part of it. But we've got to understand our place, or think about our place within the wider world, the wider ecosystem of the planet. So to conclude, climate change is system change. We've left it so late. We could have solved climate change with the usual technocratic solutions if we started in 1990. It's now 2020. We've got a whisper, just almost no carbon budget left. So now it has become system change, and that is a consequence of our choice to fail. And as Einstein noted, at least it's attributed to Einstein, but no one knows if he really said it or not, but insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I would say thus far we've spent 30 years pursuing insanity since the first IPCC report, and the emissions just keep going up. So it's about time that we moved away from sort of an insane approach to responding to climate change and started to have a sane and more moral, I think, approach to these issues. Perhaps in 2020 the times are changing. Going back to Leonard Cohen, ring the bells that still can ring. There are plenty of things that we can do. Forget perfect offerings about magical technologies in the future. There's a crack in everything. There are plenty of cracks out there. You're all out here on an evening now. You wouldn't have, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have got groups like this talking on climate change. And when you've got these cracks, that's how the light gets in. And that's, in a sense, what we all are. We're all shards of light that are hopefully going to change the debate, change the action, and bring about a completely low carbon, more progressive future. And I think in that role, I think Sweden has a reputation and a certain responsibility over and above its 10 million population, because people do look to Sweden for some sorts of leadership. And the development of a new refinery producing more oil and gas, or petrol and diesel, is no sign of a progressive society. So on that note, thanks for listening.